Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. Alexey Arestovich is with us live. It is War Diary, the first one in this year. Hello Alexey. Good evening. And Merry Christmas. It is Christmas, right. It's Orthodox Christmas. It's difficult to navigate between all these calendars and different Christmases, but overall. All right, Lex Fridman is number 1 or 2. We have a ton of questions to discuss today. I did not sleep much last night. I watched the whole interview that Zelensky gave to Lex, and perhaps there'll be a lot of argument to carry over that conversation. It's not exactly clear which audience is Vladimir Zelensky trying to influence with this interview. I have a feeling that he's not exactly sure which audience is he addressing to. Or is it not so? In your opinion, what audience was his target? Nikolai, he's working on the inner audience, on the Ukrainian audience. And also, you mean exclusively? Exclusively. And also on the position that is designed to defend the opinion of these audience and Zelensky's opinion in front of Trump, Musk, and their audience. The problem is that I think this audience for Zelensky is only maybe 30% in Ukraine, not more. I don't understand, Alexey, why does he have to talk to Lex Fridman in order to address his inner audience? Well, Nikolai, Lex Fridman is the second popular blogger in the US among the right electorate. He is also a personal friend of Elon Musk and a whole other list of big, well-known people. And it is easier to communicate a lot of things through that figure. So what I think is a key takeaway here is that it is an opinion of maybe 25-30% of Ukrainians. What about the rest? How about the 70? And what's curious, Nikolai, is that the voices of those 70 are subdued by very loud screaming of the 30%. And also the position of government power, which is continually repressing everybody who is not sharing their point of view. And the second interesting point is that the remaining 70% of Ukrainians still continue to hold the opinion of Zelensky and his election program on which he came to power. And the 30% were actually criticizing him initially, and now he completely flip-flopped on that. And he's basically, again, the proponent of the topic of army, speech, and faith 2.0. So what about the 70% that initially supported him? The key word for this year is bussification, putting people in buses in Ukraine and sending them to front today. And, I would understand if there would not be somebody like us and maybe a few other bloggers who are talking about this problem openly, because we have only open opinion to share, and he has one answer to us. You are a spy. You are all Moscow spies. Let's put you in a bus and send you to die in the groves on the front. All right, Alexey, for me, it is very important that Zelensky trying to influence Trump in future discussions, negotiations that will happen. We understand they will at some point. Zelensky still has no solution that he offers. It appears to me that he is trying to dump the sack with potatoes on the Trump's territory and leave him with solving this problem the way he sees fit. And we're just telling you that you will also have to convince us to make sure that we like your decision. It seems to me to be a very infantile position, and I wonder if Zelensky understands that this is how he perceived in the United States after this speech. Well, Nikolai, I think I approximately understand what he knows and what he intends. He had a position. His position is that, first, you need to provide certain guarantees, real guarantees to Ukraine, which Biden administration failed to provide. We are not exactly sure, Zelensky's opinion, that Trump will be able to provide. EU definitely is incapable to provide that. You scoundrels deceived us many times already. Second, we need a guarantee in a form of a lot of arms. You need to provide us with a stockpile of weapons. A third point is we need a guarantee in a form of joining NATO. And point 4 is invitation to European Union. So President Zelensky sees 4 kinds of guarantees, And he does have a position. The other question would be how realistic this position is. Well, understandable, Alexey. Even Fridman in this interview is saying that this is unrealistic. Tomorrow Trump leaves NATO and what? And the president doesn't have an answer to that question. Right, he doesn't have an answer. They think only non-binary. They have an option A, there is no option B. And this is a position that he stated. I see that this position is supported by the so-called patriotic speakers in Ukraine who are mostly leaning towards army, speech, and faith slogan. But the goal of every communication is a reaction to that communication, right? So when Zelensky is making these statements, what is he going for? What can he achieve with that? What can he achieve when he says that I do not respect Putin and the whole Russian people? And on the next thesis he says is that we are planning to sign on the 25th a peace treaty with him. So Putin is Voldemort, he's an old idiot, but we still want to sign a peace treaty. Russian people are orcs and scoundrels, but we will definitely sign truce accords with them. Alexey, well, it's not guaranteed about peace, right? It's interesting to see how will Putin treat that and what will American society say about that. Nikolai, I can give you an example. Imagine you and I quarreled. We had 6 or 10 years of argument. Then Roman Pope comes over and wants to pacify us. And we decide, okay, let's sit down at the table. Roman Pope says, bless you children, let's be peaceful in the coming 2025. I say, yes, of course, take one of the salad bowls and put it on your head. Pope says, well, wait, this action actually goes against the intent of our discussion here, to which I say, no, this is exactly designed to help this conversation going, and then I take additional glass of champagne and pour it under your shirt while cussing and screaming at you. Right, Alexey, better take a hot tea. Right, and that's what I'm saying. Based on all that, of course, we will be invited into NATO, given all weapons, and supported by everybody, right? This is our position, in brief. All right, Alexey, he says that he doesn't respect Russian language and Russian people. So he also does not separate Russian people from Russian government. It is all mixed as one bowl of porridge in his head, right? I have a question. If in Israel they treated Arabs and Arabic language in that fashion, because of the issues and conflicts between the governments and the countries of adjacent to Israel countries. Nikolai, I'll tell you more. All negotiations and all the behind-the-scenes negotiations in Zelensky's office have always been conducted in Russian. All the communications there are conducted in Russian. So here we have a person coming out and saying that I have no respect to the language that I grew up speaking. I have no respect to the language of my mother. Right? Meantime, I'm sitting watching that and remembering that I have not seen a single meeting conducted in Ukrainian in his office. And I spent 2.5 years there. And pretty remarkable years, right? And when people are saying, no, he was different back then and now he changed, it is not so. Trust me. I know for a fact it is not so. So this is just pretending. This is posing and posturing in front of the camera. And the reasons are, first, I like the troll. He likes the troll, that role of the leader who is suffering for his nation, who is going to fight to the end. And second is his fear to face the radicals. Because right now, especially with this war going, there are a lot of radically motivated military servicemen. If we go back to the 9th of December of 2019, he was afraid to execute the Paris Accords, although the situation back then was much milder. There were maybe 900 radicals running around the government quarters, and they were protected. The quarters were protected by 17,000 of National Guard. But today, these radicals are presented by brigades with some heavy equipment, so I don't think he is not afraid of them. And third, I think he's still hoping that with his stubbornness, he will eventually prevail somehow. But this is not how it works. He will not get one. First, do not deceive people. If you speak Russian in your life, it is BS to say that you do not accept Russian language. Second, when you are afraid of radicals, you need to understand that The politics is always to be conducted in the interests of majority. And when you have such a big split between 70 and 30%, you need to play to 70%. They are the ones who voted for you. They are the ones who gave you the mandate. And this is the key part of your people. And with those radicalized 30, you need to find common language and you need to weave them into the common good, perhaps telling them on some things that no, this is not going to happen, but on the others, perhaps supporting them and using them to, for example, fortify the enforcement agencies of the country. This is how the leader of 100% of Ukrainians would do. I've seen in this interview a lot of other interesting things. I see a very negative reception of this interview by the group of Americans who were supposed to be target of this interview. For the second day, my phone is ringing, and they are, let me formulate it better, they're very different marks and grades given to this interview, being very delicate, from the praises sung by the patriotic Ukrainians at home. That's why in this interview, I did not see the president of 70% of Ukrainians or 100% of Ukrainians. I saw, like Poroshenko, the president of 30%. Army, speech, faith. Who will be representing the rest of the country? So it was an interesting interview. It was calculated to become a part of a presidential campaign. So he goes to the election as unwavering leader of unbent Ukraine. And he's working in the same image that he had since the beginning of March of 22. Since that time, the situation changed dramatically, many times. It is very different. And if you're a smart politician, even if you're following the same goals, you would be looking for different ways to get there. Perhaps specifically looking at the American audience if you're giving this interview for the English-speaking audience. An American audience found a lot of incongruences in that. Not even talking about an attempt to be liked by Trump administration that was made in the most clumsy fashion. I don't know who consulted him on this, but this is a very non-Trump style of communication. He does not appreciate when he's dumped the bag of hot potatoes onto his territory and basically told to go figure it out. And we'll see if we like it. And also in Trump's team, there are a lot of people who, being very delicate here, have a very specific opinion about Ukraine, about Zelensky government, and you need to be very careful talking to them, not to push them away completely. Because Zelensky in his speech basically reaffirmed all the suspicions and all their fears. They see a stubborn leader who is representing stubborn people who do not want to do anything with Trump's proposal to end this war. And American point of view on this is, okay, we have a proposition, but you refuse it, and then you demand more arms, and you demand us to continue helping you. How do we understand that? Alexey, one of the things that really piqued my interest is that 4 years of Trump is an insignificant time to procure peace in Ukraine. And this is a very strong statement, actually, that is basically saying that you're Trump in power, Trump is of no consequence to us. It is not enough for us, because after that you will be gone, and what are we to do? Right, Nikolai, the statement roughly sounds like this in American ear, that your ideas, your capabilities, and your term in office is nothing. So he's sending this message to the president, who's going to be a second-time president, who vowed to finish this war. He promised 39 times on record to his electors that he will finish this war. And Zelensky is sending a message which basically amounts to a face slap to Donald Trump. The only worse message would be to directly accuse him. But in this conversation, there were barely veiled some serious concerns about Trump's capabilities. So that's why I'm thinking I'll give you just a good advice in order to understand how was this interview taken. Lex Fridman is a programmer. He deals with artificial intelligence, doctor of science, and he made a soundtrack. There is an ideal conversation there, an ideal translation, even meeting the tones of voices of Lex and Zelensky. But I suggest you to do one interesting thing. Let me open this interview. I'll show you here on the screen. You will see that if you click languages, what audio tracks can you pick? There will be English original, but the first one above it will be English UK in parentheses. Click that one. Do not click the original. It is not the original. The actual original is the English United Kingdom. And listen to what was actually said. And you may change your opinion about what was actually and how it was presented. Everything is slightly different from the second soundtrack. At least you may create certain conclusions based on this soundtrack. All right, Alexey, so to sum up that whole foreign agenda, I want to pay attention to Macron's statement, who made one today, midday, when he appealed to Ukraine to conduct realistic discussions about the territorial questions. He also mentioned that besides Ukrainians, and only Ukrainians actually can conduct these realistic discussions about their territory. He's saying that besides Ukrainians, nobody should. So Macron is highlighting here that if there will be no realistic positions from Ukrainians, they shouldn't be expecting it from anybody else. They shouldn't be expecting Trump to realize them in a autonomous mode, or maybe Putin figuring things out. This is Ukraine's business. So when the framework that is stated is unrealistic, is beyond any criticism, it does brush all the leaders of the world in a wrong fashion towards Zelensky, right? And to Ukraine at large. What do you think it will lead to? For example, 25th of January comes. Don't know if at that Zelensky birthday, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky sit at the table. I don't know if they will come to any conclusion, but it appears that Zelensky indicates he would like to be part of these negotiations, but his intent would be to spit in the bowls of negotiators to basically disrupt them. So, what do you think we should expect? All right, Nikolai, there is a ring of agreement, so to say, the position of administration that came to power, Putin, that wants to finish this war on this stage on a certain terms. That's separate discussion. And then position of EU that is being voiced by Macron and Scholz. There is some formula of agreement. The only person who is disrupting this formula of agreement is his position and those 30% that he is relying upon, 25-30%. Army, speech, faith, 2-0. So this group does not understand how inadequate they are. It is obvious that they were always in a soap bubble and their own ideas were more important for them than the actual thinking, critical thinking about situations. But we can say that the further it goes, the bigger the gap that we're observing. And I'm reading the comments from my European and American friends who are texting me after this interview. There is a huge disconnect. Everybody in Europe and in States are holding their heads with a big question mark above them. Why? And Macron even took it upon himself to tell Zelensky that, guys, you need to prepare for these negotiations. So there is a formula of agreement, but in order to break this formula of agreement is to act against the plan of Europeans, Putin's plans and Trump plans. They all see this pacification process differently. They do have some conflict between them, but there is overarching general agreement that it's time to end this war. And those people who are opposing this vector, even if it's a Ukrainian president, they counterimpose their own figure personally against the plans of allies, our partners, and Russia. This is contradiction. And okay, let's take this contradiction. Let's take one very brave Ukraine, the 30% people that support Zelensky, and put them on one side of the weights. And then we take United States with all the armaments and GDP and their leadership under Trump on the other side of the balance. Who do you think prevails? And our position about, Zelensky's position about hoping that United States will realize the wrongness of their ways and eventually will come join Ukraine on the front and will come to tear Russia apart and make it something else. Do you think it's realistic? The other option is that, no, our partners have their own plans that are based on their own calculations, and they will go forth with their plans, which have only one roadblock on the way, the roadblock that was giving that interview to Lex. And they do have the levers to regulate that. They can just close the spigot and we get no support, and our opinion will change drastically. So what options? That's why I'm afraid that the conclusion will likely be made one way. I see it already that this conclusion has been made long before this interview on the West. And very likely it could sound something like this, that, look, Vladimir Zelensky, Putin does not want to talk to you. You do want peace, right? You do want something good for your country. That means that Putin needs to talk to somebody else. And that's how it could be phrased. Not with you, Mr. Zelensky, but he does want peace. You are for peace too, right? Right. So there is only one obstacle to peace. You need to make one step to the side and go in the shadows. And if not, then free Western press, they are free, right? So they can start running different publications. They can do some investigative journalism. They also have friends in Ukraine who can help them investigate a few things. And we can also remember the interview of a future possible head of the FBI who said we need to conduct an audit of our expenses and trenches to Ukraine that will show us what happened with our resources that we sent. And the key point in this interview, one of the hottest topics that a lot of people are upset about, is that Zelensky refused to acknowledge corruption in Ukraine. He said that they don't have corruption. We've been slapping everybody's hand and will continue doing it. But on the background, there is an ongoing scandal about mines going from mortars to the front that do not shoot. And if you dig a little deeper, you don't even need to dig much. There is a ton more scandals that Zelensky refused to acknowledge. So on the key positions, I think he failed. And of course, none of the politicians will acknowledge that. But you can look at the United Nations report that Ukraine violates the rights of church, that throwing people in buses is conducted in a way that violates human rights. And I also remind that there was going to be a report of Transparency International published in June, but it never happened. And a lot of lobbyists wasted a lot of resources to prevent this publication from happening, basically on the backdrop that, hey, we're fighting here for our lives, please hold off on the disparaging materials, but one day it may still surface. And I think that he will not be able to roadblock United States and Europe alone. But he did make his position clear in this interview that he's not going to give in. He will do everything to break these plans as they are happening now. And he's making actions, for example, counteroffensive in Kursk district of Russia. And his suggestion is that if you will really, really try, Western allies, you can be of some use by giving us $300 billion and a lot of arms. It would be funny if Zelensky understood that it would be a similar position if the head of some district in Kiev would be giving him these terms. Listen, President, we have an opinion of 30% of this district who do not like your politics. You need to give us arms and a lot of money and do what we ask it to. So if he got this message, he was supposed to execute it. What other options? No, Alexey, I will not agree with you. This is not that district. I think that district would be Pokrovsk district. Oh, right. So yeah, they did, Alexey, just to wrap it up, they did approve a budget for Pokrovsk for beautification of a city, right? It's only 2.5 miles, Nikolai, that the front line is from the border of the city. And we see in the budget that for defense of the city, for fortifications, we designate 10 million, and for beautification of the city, we designated 60 million. You know, Lex was a very calm and soft interviewer, because if he was a hard interviewer, he would rip Zelensky apart. That's why it was done with Lex and not with Tucker, not with Valuetainment, not with Joe Rogan, because each of those would have ripped Zelensky a new one. And Lex, he is an idealist. He's saying that Zelensky is a good fellow, his team are good people, Therefore, if Patrick from Valuetainment would be talking with Zelensky, he would not let Zelensky jump off the hook. He has a very strict style. He would bring an article to the screen, and probably a translated article from Ukraine. This is your local media reporting on your corruption, or this is international publication reporting on the corruption. Yes or no? I don't think Zelensky would be able to handle himself well in these harsher environments, because then he would be torn apart, his position would be dismantled, and you would see the real attitude of Ukrainian audiences to that. And now they're sitting in some warm bath because Lex presented Zelensky as a fantastic person of a great country fighting for their own fantastic reasons. But Lex does suffer, does hurt for the pains of people. So it's just his style. It's not a hard interview that he conducted. A good interviewer would ask Zelensky, why did you spend 10 million for defense while spending 60 on beautification? What happened with the 155th Brigade that was prepared on the money of French partners, 800 million euros, the one that fell apart before even hitting Ukraine? And a lot of other concrete questions which surfaced, for example, just this week, and for which Zelensky does not have any answers. You know, Alexey, I do want to go over these questions that surfaced this week, but before this happens, I want to ask you one more question that sends us back to Paris Accords that you mentioned. And President Zelensky mentioned directly that back then there was a story that I even agreed with Putin. Lex, you don't know that history. And I did make an accord with Putin. I came there prepared, and Putin prepared that he was not ready for this topic, and I basically did all the work for him, and Putin did not contribute anything to it. Well, he maybe did the exchange of prisoners, but as for ceasefire and working around the new border, that never happened. Putin promised to act, and then he stopped picking the phone. You know, Nikolai, we have another witness. Exactly. I'm remembering that there was a different witness of this conversation, that Zelensky supposedly promised water to Crimea. I don't know if there was some non-public part of that conversation that was promised. You know, Nikolai, let's listen to the person who was at those negotiations and who definitely knows what was happening there. Here, just a second. So how did Putin behave himself with Zelensky? Very respectfully. He was addressing him in a polite manner. Yes. Very obvious feeling I got that he really wanted to find some solution. And I don't know what was not enough to not make it happen. Is it political or economic? It seems to me that we promised him something else and delivered something different. Right? Is that how you did? Yeah, probably more than we promised one thing and then didn't do anything. So here's a witness of a person who was organizing this meeting in Paris, who was there in the room with Putin and Zelensky on the Formula 2x2. And he was also the head of the office of Zelensky for a while, so he knows what exactly was happening there. Here we have two contradicting opinions. Zelensky's opinion and his head of office, who was giving an interview to Gordon. Right? Whom do we believe? That's a complex moral dilemma. All right, Alexey, is there any document that was maybe signed at that time? They did publish a document. They usually don't do that, but they couldn't hold. They were so surprised that they published it. You can type in a search and we can go over the articles of this document. You know, not everybody understands the meaning of those Paris Accords, but they had colossal meaning. And now the electorate of Petro Poroshenko will get giddy from what I say, because if we do have some of them watching us, you guys should be very happy now. Don't walk away from the screen. Do you have it, Nikolai? Paris Accords? Yes, I even see that Zelensky's press service published it, right? Perfect. All right, it says that measures to stabilize situation, a trilateral contact group, they'll be discussing implementation, further steps. I do want to send you a specific question. Water to Crimea. I did not see it in this protocol. As far as I understand, Nikolai, in his 4.5-hour interview, he did mention somewhere that Zelensky did promise to deliver water to Crimea. Okay, here's a full communique from that meeting. To finish all hostilities in Donbass by the end of the year, to exchange all prisoners of war till the March of 20th, 2020, to remove troops further away from the fighting zone, to conduct specific political actions in Donbass, to give them independent position on permanent scenario, conduct the negotiations on the Steinmeier formula, and discuss further measures if there'll be some disconnects. There was one disconnect on this, which was part of Steinmeier's formula. How do both sides perform control of the border? And here's a quote from Putin by Russian Vedomosti. Do you think there's any warming up happening with Ukraine? Yes, I think it's already happening. We will be meeting further in the Normandy format. And here we can look deeper into the Steinmeier's formula to add future changes to the constitution of Ukraine, to continue providing independence to Donbass, and to move troops away from the border. I was actually a speaker of this trilateral contact group, and I was participating in these events in Normandy format, and I know very well what was happening. Recently, there was a book published by Angela Merkel, where she describes how she saw that situation. So what she's writing, December 9th of 2019, Poroshenko is gathering radicals in the government, near the government quarters, who are chanting, "We will not let Minsk agreements to be implemented by Zelensky." Those agreements that were implemented under Poroshenko. So she's actually referring to when it was happened, is giving more details. Then she is writing that she called upon Zelensky to implement the decisions of this meeting, and later the Paris Accords happen, where they specifically communicate that previous agreements will also be fulfilled. Minsk agreements need to be fulfilled. And supporters of Poroshenko are now telling story that nobody was going to fulfill those, and they were just biding time to get ready for war, understanding that Putin will attack. Okay, so if indeed you are preparing for war, where were the mines? Why did somebody remove the mines from Chongar down south? Why were we so unprepared? Why our south crumbled so fast? Why any barricades in Kiev appeared only on the 5th day after it was semi-surrounded? So my resume out of this is very simple. Paris summit. Ukraine took formal obligations to fulfill Minsk Accords, including Steinmeier formula. So Ukraine got written off $3 billion that Yanukovych, previous president, borrowed. Ukrainian sailors captured by Russia were released back to Ukraine. That was one of the promises of Zelensky that he was running on. And after that, Ukraine stopped fulfilling anything of those obligations. And Russia was observing that for a while. And then they understand that the Europeans have no influence on Ukraine. They cannot enforce Ukraine to fulfill those obligations. Russia starts to concentrate the troops on the border with Ukraine, provoking Biden to meet with Putin on the 16th of June. They meet together. Putin is talking about something there. All the time, apparently, they're trying to assemble a Normandy format, try to bring Putin there, to put all responsibility on his shoulders. And then Putin continues to insist that he needs judicial guarantees from NATO, that they will not be expanding further to the east. He gives orders to his ambassadors to send warnings, and that's how the funnel looks like that ended up with the hot phase of this war. One of the main factors that affected it was Ukraine not fulfilling the results of the Paris Accords. We just ran away from it. I did not have full data at this point. I saw some of things that were happening from the inside. I even now don't know all the details of why did we not fulfill certain things. But we were not going to fulfill elements of it, that I know. Indeed, Russia was taking a precarious position of them not being a part of this conflict, and Ukraine had to negotiate with Lugansk and Donetsk, so-called People's Republics. But then, okay, this is not acceptable for us, but why did Poroshenko sign these agreements with these so-called republics? And then why Zelensky reaffirmed them at Paris Accords? because Russia was, from their side, were actually allowing and making certain steps in favor of Ukraine that were not even written out in those agreements, trying to induce Ukraine to fulfill them. And Zelensky continues to highlight that it was Poroshenko who signed wrong agreement in Minsk, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and then he highlighted that in Paris he signed a better agreement, and yet he did not fulfill this one. So then I'm thinking that Putin understood that Ukraine and Europe are basically Europe that cannot force Ukraine to fulfill the agreements that they signed, and he has only one option of armed conflict, as he sees it. Because his problems with Ukraine at this point were coinciding with the problems he has with NATO and the EU. He clearly understands that European politicians can promise to not expand to the east only for the cadence of the current leadership. So, like Kohl promised not to expand, and then the next chancellor comes and decides to, okay, let's support it. And Putin invented an argument which he thinks is the only argument that can enforce the West to fulfill their obligations according to those agreements. A continuous threat of war, an actual war and continuous threat of war. And with that factor, war is always a trump card. Not a single politician can discard that. The left come to power, they have to consider the war probability. The right come to power, they also have to consider that there may be a hot phase of the war coming. So he evolved an ideal for him mechanism to enforce the West to follow with the agreements, and Ukraine too, as the proxy of the West as they see Ukraine in Russia. And they think this is an ideal instrument to enforce the West, to build the system of collective security in Europe. This is the formula that Putin continues to chant throughout 2021, by the way. And and he is going for some affirmation that NATO is not going to expand eastward any further. So that's his logic for starting this war. What was our logic when we promised something on the Paris Accords, but then decided not to fulfill? One of the things that Zelensky brought up, saying that the parliament didn't vote for it, well, it was your majority. Your party was in majority there. So it is on you as the leader of that party to vote for it. And again, why do you sign something that you are not aware or you know will not be fulfilled or you cannot fulfill because it depends on somebody else? Then make promises that you can fulfill. Don't take the ones that you can't. And then come up with, oh, the parliament didn't ratify it. Me personally, I don't have so much problem with them not exactly fulfilling these obligations. But my problem with this is that why did we agree to something that we knew we were not going to fulfill? And now Zelensky continues to talk that Minsk agreements were horrible and they were in a bad position for Ukraine, and delicately putting to silence that Ukraine was not going to fulfill Paris Accords. And one needs to reveal that to show that the situation, how the situation unfolded. Paris summit was on the 9th of December. Till the end of March, roughly, Putin is still trying to force Ukraine to get to fulfill the agreements. On the 21st of March, I think, he is making a phone call to Macron and Merkel, and the last offer to somehow influence Ukraine. And that's what she writes in her book too. That's where she outlines that she understands that Putin is losing faith in Europe as being a mediator, a mediating force between Russia and Ukraine. And he is making other decisions, and he is trying to talk to United States instead because he thinks that Europe, France, Germany, they're no subjects of these negotiations anymore. Then they meet with Biden in June, not exactly sure what they talked about. Maybe Trump administration will publicize some of these materials. And the last conversation that Biden had with Putin was on the 13th, about 9 days before the war, right? They talked about something. And Burns, right, he did also fly to meet Putin, right, as Washington Post was publishing. We don't know the details of these communications, but apparently they were talking about something. But it does seem more and more that, sorry, I've lost the train of thought here. Sorry for interjecting, Alexey. But yeah, I mean, ballpark, that's the funnel. That's how the events unfolded. And that's my answer and questions. Why are we not fulfilling, why we're not taking obligations that we do not fulfill? And I don't know if Zelensky sincerely believes that Putin is not fulfilling Paris Accords and it's his fault. But I am putting the words of Bohdan that we put here, the book by Merkel, where she's outlining her point of view and my memories that I remember and that I know from those times. And Poroshenko and his radicals threatening to make sure Zelensky does not fulfill the Ukrainian obligations. The key to all that, and Kozak, representative of the Russian side on those negotiations, was saying that the key to all that situation is Ukraine's inability to deal with the demands of the radicals. That's where the key to this problem. This was also pointed out by representatives of France and Germany. This is the key to everything. You guys in Ukraine government are afraid of demands of your radicals, so that macho Zelensky, who is presenting himself as ambitious, nobody can manage me, and is laughing about the supposition maybe Yermak has some influence on him. I remember those 400 radicals who were walking in the government quarters and 17,000 National Guard defending us from them. So where was that bravery? Now these radicals are partially killed in war, partially still fighting in the trenches, fighting for all that. And Zelensky is sitting in his office telling that Putin is to blame and not his inability to deal with Ukrainian radicals, if we are, as adults, observing his responsibility for this situation. And a real interviewer would be asking these questions of Zelensky, but I will say here that Lex is a kind person. He's asking questions about the future, not about the past. Well, it's his right, Alexey, right? President Zelensky in his interview did say about a lot of responsibility of other presidents and other countries for what's happening. Right, Nikolai, nothing about his own. Exactly. And he also ignored the collective responsibility of his country, of Ukraine. When he talks about Ukraine was forced to give up nuclear arms. Okay, but we were not forced to sell all the other armaments we had. We were selling APCs, tanks, jets, and we're not talking about some old scrap that we cut and sold by pieces for metal, for scrap. We're talking about actual weapons. Exactly, Nikolai. When this war started, the countries whom we sold those tanks and armored personnel carriers, I remember their surprised eyes when Ukraine came back to them asking, hey, can you sell them back to us for this war? And I still remember their surprised faces when they're saying that, guys, your Kyiv is in semicircle, you're fighting for your survival, supposedly, but your representative is asking us to sell it for 850 while we are trying to sell for 600. We're giving you a discount. And I understand somebody wanted to beef up their pockets with money. And who was that, Alexey? Well, those were Zelensky's government responsible people who were in charge of buying all the equipment and munitions. In 91, Ukraine had the biggest military group in Europe. Armaments and all. Where is all that? Were we enforced to sell it or to transfer it to somebody? There was enough weapons in this group to capture Russia all the way to Vladivostok. Even if we had a fifth of this stockpile left, we could fight successfully. What happened with the warehouses that blew up under Poroshenko? Since 2014 to about 22nd of 22, Ukrainian forces spent about 70,000 tons of munitions in fighting with Russia, and that before the main hot phase. The warehouses that blew had 250,000 tons, and they still cannot find the guilty party. Neither Poroshenko nor Zelensky. We had the most valuable nomenclature there. Missiles for Smerch systems, the ones that we do not produce anymore. And then they were looking for Smerch missiles, and, by the 4th of April, we only had 4 of those left. So that's how we were preparing for this war, both Poroshenko and Zelensky. So, of course, the blame is on Putin. He's an aggressor who made a solemn decision to start this war, the hot phase and the big invasion, and it's thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives of soldiers and civilians are on him. But the share of responsibility and guilt in this, well, not guilt, responsibility in this conflict is on European partners and on Ukraine. and our presidents. And administration of Trump, I hope, will investigate about what are the real reasons that preclude this war from getting concluded. And Zelensky continues in this recent interview to evade the topic of responsibility. Everything is being blamed on Putin, that he is a hellspawn, that he is Voldemort, and that coincides with the moods of Ukrainians who are suffering under Russian bombs right now, but is absolutely incongruent to real politics, to making sure you find a solution to the problem and determine the proper cause and consequence connection. And when you approach with such tool, the prognostication tells that the outcome will be unfavorable. You will not get joined to NATO, you will not get arms, and you will be in a much worse condition. But emotionally, of course, it's satisfying. You cussed Putin 7 ways to Sunday, you added him to the Legion of Hellspawns, and you feel better naming him. But he continues to achieve his goals stubbornly, and we are still discombobulated. So what do we see? We see that Putin is leading the country that attacked us, and systemically he continues to fulfill his goals. Yeah, with problems, of course, but he is definitely grinding to them. We see the West that asks us to acknowledge the reality of war and to understand how we can help them understand how to solve it. And then we see a good third of Ukrainians who are stubbornly resisting and fighting and saying we'll never negotiate. And we are unbending and unwavering. So we'll see what happens. Just a couple of weeks left till the 20th of January. Kellock has not arrived yet. When he arrives to Ukraine, follow the rhetoric of our official politicians. See where it swings after. But there is a nuance. On the West, there are already no politicians who still believe any obligations that Ukraine takes. They're already not believing that because Ukraine has not fulfilled any of the promises, neither at the time pre-war, when we're supposedly preparing for it, nor during the war. And they also add that Ukraine failed to deliver on the promises, but Putin did fulfill on all the promises that he gave to the West. And they're saying that they don't like Putin, they don't want to deal with him, he's not a good guy, but he fulfills his promises. And you, good people, are failing to fulfill whatever obligations you take upon yourself. So how can we proceed with this? All right, one more question about this whole trip I want to ask. I keep going back to the message of Zelensky that 4 years that we get under Trump is not enough for us. But I'm thinking that 4 years could be all that we have, really, to develop our situation, to change it somehow. And every day of delay in these 4 years will be not in our favor. And Alexey, it would be good for us, I think, to realistically approach to the next 4 years and approach the whole process of rebuilding the inner processes during these 4 years. I want to hear your opinion. During these 4 years of Trump, if the destiny, the fate decides that there will be a ceasefire and there'll be some diplomatic activity happening instead of fighting, in your view, what can be done during these 4 years to rebuild our inner processes in such fashion so we can try to evade the second round of this war? Nikolai, we can do a lot of colossal things. We can beef up our enforcement agencies, military-industrial complex. We can bring back the motivation for our citizens to stay in this country and to work for this country. We need to turn our country to face our citizens. But again, this all depends upon who will come, which team will come and will be implementing these politics. Right now in Ukraine, 30% aggressive have prevailed over 70% thinking otherwise, who believed Zelensky, who voted for him, and then he jumped camp. So from the point of view of these 70%, Zelensky radically changed and went to the camp of their political opponents, so Poroshenko, against whom they voted, army, speech, and faith. That's what they're writing in the commentary to this interview, if you are going to read that. So the question is, who will be implementing that? If it'll be the same administration that we have now, Zelensky administration, we'll see a repetition of the same. Here are a couple examples, right? You'll understand your perspectives. Now it's war, right? It's martial law. The effectivity of government under martial law can be 30% more effective than peacetime, right? Now, 155th Kievan Brigade, French donate money to make sure that happens. They send it, and most of them disband. Most of them don't want to fight, and the brigade is running worse than the other brigades. So they gather an emergency meeting, and Syrsky makes a statement there that this is the brigade commander who is in charge. This is not the system or anybody else. And Colonel who was responsible for forming this brigade, he died of a heart attack after all this. So Syrsky refuses to acknowledge his responsibility. Civilians start to understand that, even though it's not their purview. But from the point of view of army, when the commander drops responsibility on his subordinates facing his own superior, this actually is an immediate disqualification. A normal commander, according to the officer and the military code, even if he is guilty and his subordinates are guilty, maybe not he is personally guilty, but he always takes blame on himself. And it crumbles otherwise. So Zelensky points at Syrsky, Syrsky points at somebody down, and eventually some officer, some NCO bears responsibility for everything. So Zelensky is about that reaction, that chain of avoiding responsibility. And we don't see it. Zelensky takes it. He did not pose a question back to Syrsky, what the F are you talking about? You are in charge. Why are you talking about brigade commander? He is in charge of his own processes. That's not on him, that's on you. Right? So Zelensky, unfortunately, is not about that. 50 people deserted from this brigade already in France, even before it was shipped to Ukraine, after being formed. This is so low that it's difficult to pick anything lower. Another example, Umerov makes a statement that inspection from Minister of Defense will be reviewing our army, reasons for negative reports, reasons for losing, what is happening in the army, will be changing the structure, the way it is being used, and not a word from this commission about who was ordering army a year ago and who brought it to such state that now it needs investigating. Oh, General Syrsky was the one in charge, and now Drapati is supposedly responsible, a newly appointed one. Why is it not being discussed? Problems always have names. And if you're not naming real persons who can bear and should bear the blame, you will never figure out what and how happened. Now, another example about mortar mines. Shots from mortar. They're not shooting, not exploding. Yuri Butusov is investigating that they're not exploding. The army shoots them, but they don't work. And moreover, as he brings to light, the officers who write the reports about faulty mines, they're forced to not to withdraw their reports and to not write them. And your relatives, your sons, brothers, fathers, and daughters who are fighting on the front are now fighting with mines, with mortar shots that do not explode. And Zelensky's propaganda is putting other messaging into media. So it is easy to find who is in charge of these mines. And they already figured out what's with technology, the way they're pouring explosive is wrong. But it is easy to find who needs to be replaced and how to fix it. Remember Israel, when they were making these mortars and the shots during the war in their backyards? And we cannot organize the production. So preparation to this war, we failed on that. We entered this war in a complete state of mess on the most ridiculous categories when the commander-in-chief is pointing at his subordinates. The worse than that is only to blame the dead, right? Sometimes that also happens. And the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, the organizations that are supposed to produce arms and munitions, they're producing faulty munitions, and we still cannot determine the causes and reasons for that and the guilty parties. And that's having martial law and superior capabilities to run any process in this country. So what do you think will be the outlook for the situation after this war, when martial law will not be an option? Right, that'll be very foggy perspectives, Alexey. Or, Nikolai, do they need more power to fix anything? Do they need to get even more levers. 70% of Ukraine are suppressed and under continuous threat of repressions from the Zelensky's party, continuous threats to get thrown into a bus and thrown to a fight. And did you see that recent video when women are saying to the drafting commission, the ones who are gathering people on the street, that no, we're not going to give you our men? Well, did you see what he answered? You voted for that system, now you have to eat it. Okay, end of this hour. Thank you guys if you enjoyed. Do not forget to click like and subscribe. Really appreciate that. It's the word of mouth that helps our channel to grow and allows us to continue translating these materials, presenting somewhat different point of view on the events happening in Ukraine, arguably having a bit more logic and strategic thinking behind it than the current leadership of the country does. And if you really like what we do, you can click that super thanks button. Thank you. Privateer out.